know me, you know that chocolate is one of my favorite topics. And I'm thrilled to have today with me Dr. Jen Kraker to talk about that favorite subject. Just a little bit about logistics here. The chat is open, but the chat is only enabled to send a message to Jen and myself. If there's something that you'd especially like us to cover today, please go ahead and enter that in the chat. Also, the Q&A has been enabled, and we'd love to have your questions throughout the discussion. So please feel free to enter questions at any time. Also, we're available to stay online until the top of the hour, should the discussion warrant that, and the questions warrant that. So we certainly have time if you have the time. Just a quick note that we are recording, as you will see. And I guess a little bit about our backgrounds before we get started, Jen. So a little bit about myself, and then I'd love to introduce my friend, Dr. Kraker. As many of you know, I am a longtime foodie and experimental home cook. I am passionate about nutrition, especially the accessibility of real nutrient-dense food for everyone. I'm passionate about gender equity and reversing the deterioration of our planet, our natural environment. And I recently decided to pursue or focus on these passions, leaving a career in professional services to build a community that will further the efforts of women leading the way to a healthier future through food. So furthermore, we form syndicates to invest in women who are building health through a better food system. And while investing is our primary area of focus, we also seek to create greater connection with food and greater connection with women who are providing for that healthier food system. And also to educate about the challenges and opportunities with our food system. And that's really why we're here today. To educate and to create this connection, this better connection with chocolate and with Jen. So for a little bit about Jen, first of all, I should note that you can find a full interview with Jen on the Furthermore website. But for a bit of background on Dr. Kraker here, she is a Columbia and Cornell trained psychiatrist, nutritionist, and certified nutrigenomics expert, excuse me. She's dedicated to optimizing mental health. She is a pioneer in the practice of nutritional psychiatry and has studied nutrition for over 20 years. And she's treated thousands of patients from all over the world. Looking at the interface of nutrition, genetics, and hormones, she is proud to have helped more people get off their medications than putting them on medication. Dr. Jen Kraker works with anyone seeking better brain health and higher performance. She is unrelenting in her approach to get to the root cause of her patient's suffering. And she's on a mission to disrupt the field of psychiatry through education and access to an integrative mental health approach, offering methods to heal beyond medication and meditation. She is a proud mother of a 9-year-old son and loves all things, including the ocean, wellness, outdoors, and gourmet healthy cuisine. We're so fortunate to have you with us today, Jen. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
A couple of other quick things to call out. We just wanted to make sure that you understand we're talking about the connection today between dark chocolate consumption and health, not dark chocolate production and the health impact to communities, to farmers, to workers, to the environment. Those are completely separate and very important topics, but today we're talking about the link between dark chocolate consumption and health. And just a quick reminder, something I have to say, because Furthermore is an investment firm. Any content shared today is informational only and not an offer of solicitation or recommendation to buy or sell securities or pursue any particular investment strategy, and does not constitute the provision of investment advice. Information may not be used or relied upon in evaluating the merits of any investment, and you should always consult your own advisors as to business, financial, tax, legal, or other related matters concerning any investment. Okay, now that that's over, let's talk about the background. Why are we here today? Well, in December, as many of you know, Consumer Reports and Consumer Lab released reports revealing the high levels of lead and cadmium that were present in many chocolate bars that they tested. Before we get into the specifics, let's revisit why dark chocolate is so good for us, what we've been told, and maybe Jen, you can set us straight. Maybe it's still the case, but we've all heard over the past decade or so, especially Jen, that the flavonols in chocolate are heart healthy, that dark chocolate is a superfood, it's a mood lifter, it's an energy booster. And we know that flavonols are higher in dark chocolate. The higher the percentage of cocoa ingredients, the better. I personally aim for 85% cocoa or higher because I want to avoid the sugar, which in this case would represent the remaining 15% minus any potential flavorings like vanilla or emulsifiers. When the Consumer Lab and Consumer Reports articles came out, I received a number of emails and texts from friends. I've been touting the health benefits for years, literally carrying chocolate in my bag at all times and loving to share dark chocolate with my friends, and everyone knew that. I likely consume, on average, an ounce or so, perhaps more, of dark chocolate per day, through squares of chocolate bars, through cocoa nibs that I add to literally everything, including baked goods. Maybe it's chocolate through ice cream. I consume, if I really think about it honestly, quite a bit of dark chocolate. So I'm concerned. And I think we all need to do our best to educate ourselves on this topic and frankly, understand the source and issues with all that we put in our bodies. So Jen, with that, remind us, what is it about dark chocolate that is good for us?
So thank you for all that. I share your love of dark chocolate and dark cocoa beans, and with high percentage, for the very reason of the health benefits as well as the pleasure and the taste and all of it. It's been, I think the Cinco Mayans discovered it, the cocoa bean, over 5,000 years ago. This has been in our vernacular and health and sort of thought of as an elixir by the Aztecs and many for years. The cocoa bean itself is so rich in polyphenols and flavonoids. And I will use those terms interchangeably. Polyphenols is sort of this umbrella term of health components. A subset of that is flavonols, and inside flavonols are at least 100 other biochemical components. For the sake of this presentation and our talk today, I will just refer to it interchangeably as polyphenols and flavonols. They independently have a tremendous amount of health benefits. So the cocoa bean itself contains at least 18% of polyphenols and flavonols. They're found in nature everywhere. They're found in fruits, vegetables, apples, dark cranberries are thought to have particularly high quantities, green tea as well, green leafy vegetables. But among all of those, the cocoa bean is thought to have among the highest in itself in the bean. So that's why this has sort of been a well sought after, highly nutrient dense particular food. What do these polyphenols do? My goodness, the lists are endless. I'll start with the brain because it's personally my favorite organ as a psychiatrist. It's very neuroprotective. It upregulates dopamine. It increases neuroregenesis. If your neurons are feeling like vulnerable or a neuron is damaged in any way, it actually has a protective mechanism to regenerate that neuron. So it's been linked to be a protective agent in things like Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease. Has very high, dark chocolate in the cocoa bean itself has very high contents of iron. It has high contents of magnesium, of zinc. So it's very rich in minerals, and that in itself is helpful. Inside the polyphenol, it's thought to be a protective aspect of the plant itself, to protect it from nature, from the sun, from its own environment. So as the plant is being protected by sun damage, interestingly, when we actually consume the cocoa bean and the polyphenol, it does actually protect our skin to some extent. It's thought to be an antioxidant for free radicals and things in nature that could be damaging. It has tremendous effects on our cardiovascular disease. It literally, on the inside of our artery linings, you've probably heard of the endothelial lining. If you haven't, that's okay. It's just a fancy word for the inside of our arteries and veins. And inside that, when there's little damage and insult, that inflammation is what causes cardiovascular disease. It protects that internal lining of the arteries and vessels from that inflammatory response. it has these properties where it inhibits certain enzymes. So we absorb food through our intestine and it's broken down by various enzymes. When the enzymes break down various things, that's how we absorb them. Well, interestingly, the polyphenols inside cocoa beans actually inhibit the absorption of some saturated fats, as well as some blood sugar or some carbohydrates. So it's thought to both regulate our insulin regulation by stimulating an increase in insulin, as well as decreasing the absorption of sugar in itself. So that is thought to regulate blood sugar. Additionally, because of it inhibiting that enzyme that would absorb more fatty acids, it actually decreases LDL cholesterol. So if we think about a summary of this, we're talking about protection from cancer from the sun, more like topical cancers. It's not related to breast cancer, any internal organ cancers, but more topical cancers, thought to stabilize blood sugar, help cardiovascular disease, neuroprotective, help stimulate mood. I mean, it goes on and on.
It is the superfood.
Yeah, it is the superfood.
It's why I eat so much of it. Yes. It's amazing. There's a lot actually I didn't realize. A lot of benefits, Jen, I didn't realize. But there's so much hype, right? There's so much out there that talks about how good chocolate is for you. It seems like it's a no-brainer. And I know that many of us just consume it because we hear, oh, it is one of those superfoods, but it has more health impact, positive health impact than I even realized. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So to the potentially darker side, right? Unfortunately, with the release of the consumer reports and consumer lab analysis, we now know that very high levels of lead and cadmium have been found in numerous chocolate bars. I believe 28 bars from various brands were tested, and these are brands that are much larger, more familiar brands to brands that are much more artisanal, making much more artisanal chocolate. For 23 of the bars, eating just an ounce a day would put an adult over a level that public health authorities say may be harmful for at least one of those heavy metals. And 5 of the bars were above those levels for both cadmium and lead. Just quickly, because I think it's important if you haven't read the report, the safer options, according to Consumer Reports, are the masked organic dark chocolate bar at 80%, the Taza Deliciously Dark at 70%, 2 Ghirardelli bars, the Intense Dark 86% and the Intense Dark 72%, and a Valrhona bar, Albinau at 85%. So this leads me, I guess, to my next question, Jen, which is, at these high levels, like what do we need to know about this study? I mean, for the lay person, it seems really, really concerning that so many chocolate bars were tested at such tremendously high levels. What are the important things that we need to know about both of these studies? So putting in some context and background, we're exposed to cadmium and lead on a daily basis. They are ubiquitous in the environment. The cadmium in particular is found in shellfish, is found in grains and wheats and vegetables. Lead similarly is found in dust particles in the environment, from gasoline, from all sorts of sources. So with that in context, we're all exposed to this on some level. They say the average food consumption that one is willing or able to tolerate, according to government authorities, including the US government, the FDA, European authorities, public health authorities, they say that no food product should have more than 4.1 micrograms per gram a day, and children is 3.1 per day. They say the average adult is on balance exposed to about 25 micrograms per day. So that's sort of context for proportion. What did these studies look at? So Consumer Reports and consumer labs independently tested all these chocolate products, which is important to know that they didn't have any skin in the game and they are not employed by any of these chocolate manufacturers. So they're independent looking for this exposure. And they did find that there's higher levels of cadmium and lead, more cadmium, I will say, than lead in many of the products that were tested, which is certainly concerning. For the average consumer, I will say, while chocolate is ubiquitously consumed and widely available, and most everyone consumes chocolate with some frequency, I think we're really talking about
people like Alaina and I, to be quite frank, which is probably why we're on this call, that we are high consumers. Because we see it as a superfood. So if you're an average consumer and have a handful of chocolate here or there, or for a celebratory holiday, Valentine's Day is coming up, you have nothing to worry about. We are able to detoxify these things. If you're a high consumer, I think it's high time we pay attention to where your chocolate is being sourced and what is in it. The studies sort of look at both consumer labs in particular, looked at the heavy metal content as well as the high potency of how potent the flavonoids are within the cocoa products that were being advertised. So that's a little more comprehensive to know where you're getting both the good stuff and what's toxic exposure, whereas the consumer reports really reveals some of the bars that have just toxic metals. Can I clarify more? Is there something more you wanted to know about?
So a couple comments coming in.
Sure.
And just a quick one before we address some of these comments and questions is, Jen, how do we check our levels of lead and cadmium? I mean, you also noted that it's not just chocolate, right? We get cadmium and lead from many other sources.
Sure.
So frankly, like, I'm concerned because I know that I eat a lot of products that do have cadmium
Sure.
in addition to dark chocolate. What is the mechanism for testing cadmium and lead and other heavy metal, I guess, exposure?
So there's two ways to test it. One is through a hair analysis. You can actually do that direct to consumer. Depending on what state you live in, you may or may not have access to it. In a state you don't have access to it, the workaround is to go through Amazon.com. I have no proprietary affiliation or with these companies, but one that I would recommend is called Doctor's Data. And it's a hair sample, and you literally take a piece of hair from the back of your head, send it in, and they will give you a report. For what it's worth, I've been consuming at least a gram or more than an ounce a day for many, many years. And I had a hair sample tested probably 5 years ago, and cadmium did not show in any proportion greater than what one would expect. It was sort of nominal at best. You can also get a lab test from your local doctor. So any MD can order lead test in from Quest or LabCorp, any major lab corporation, and in your blood levels. To see if you've been exposed indeed to toxic levels.
Great. Thank you for that. A few questions, Jen, coming in. So one is, do you happen to know what prompted Consumer Reports or Consumer Lab to undertake this study?
So it's sort of well known that chocolate has exposure to these particular heavy metals. It's an old story. There was a study back in 2017 that looked at over 177 varieties of chocolates. They didn't reveal the particular brands as Consumer Reports and Consumer Labs did at this go, but it's sort of a known phenomenon. So they followed up to see, and Consumer Labs, just in my last month feed, is now looking at flax seeds and ground flax seeds and cadmium exposed there. The root of it is, I was going to talk about it later, but we'll get to it now because it's topical, that where it really comes from is pesticides in the soil where these cocoa beans are being harvested and grown. So that's a really hard thing to change very rapidly. So these cocoa beans have, because of sulfonophosphorates inside the pesticides, that it's sort of embedded in the growth of the cocoa bean, and it's just a known phenomenon. I will share generally, they found that the cocoa beans is not true for every single brand, so please don't take it to the letter, but on balance, if you're unsure and looking at a chocolate bar or chocolate product, if it comes from South America, they showed that there's far more cadmium in the cocoa beans that are harvested from South America, Peru in particular, versus those coming from Africa. And paradoxically, more in the organic products than the non-organic products.
That's interesting. Jen, can you repeat what you said about the pesticides?
Yes. So pesticides sort of are filtered in, to protect the plants from bugs and all the other reasons why people use pesticides to facilitate the growth. And inside the pesticide is something called sulfophosphates, and that leaches into the soil, which then it becomes part of the cocoa bean product as it's grown. Additionally, sometimes people use sewage and as fertilizer, and in sewage, these contaminants can also come from sewage and then find themselves inside the chocolate. Interesting.
Okay, and a follow-up question, because again, I think it follows the conversation at this point, follows
Sure.
the flow, is I mean, is there any particular labeling about lead and cadmium? Is there any way for us to know about lead and cadmium outside of the origin of the chocolate, potentially?
Sure. Unfortunately, no, not at this juncture. I would say California is sort of their Prop 65 is very avant-garde and ahead of this, and anything that exceeds anything that's thought to be safe for a regular consumption, they might get ahead of labeling, but no other state to this point has put such labels on products.
Okay. I think the origin, though, is a helpful tip, if you will. Thank you for that.
You bet.
And another question, Jen, that's come in from an attendee is, what happens if you have high levels of heavy metals? Do they disappear over time? Meaning, can you, I guess, detoxify these high level of heavy metals?
You certainly can. Lead is fortunately readily detoxified. That's sort of, you may remember from the 70s, there's a lot of lead found in old buildings and paints, and our children were exposed. And so there's something called chelating agents that if you are exposed to high levels, that's readily pulled out of the body. The particular danger in cadmium and why it's so concerning is that it has a very long half-life. What does that mean? Half-life is how long it takes a certain amount of substance to get out of your body. So let's say I happen to have an exposure, I'm making up a number here, 100 milligrams of cadmium in my body. Various organs hold on to cadmium at various times. Now, the kidneys happen to hold on to it longer than most. The kidneys have a 35-year half-life, which means if I had 100 milligrams in my body and my kidneys, it would take 35 years for me to decrease that burden to 50 milligrams of cadmium. And so over time, the accumulation of these heavy metals can be an antagonist to the absorption of things like magnesium, calcium, iron, anything that would compete with the biochemical structure of cadmium is similar to these ions with two positive valence. I don't want to get too scientific and geeky on you, but they're similar structure, which is to say that if you didn't have sufficient amounts of those minerals in your body might choose the cadmium over these minerals and therefore sort of leach onto these tissues in your body and sort of sit there for quite some time. Now, if that happens to occur in your bones or in your kidneys, which can hold, are two particular organs that hold on to this cadmium, it is very hard to sort of detoxify. There are methods and ways to do it. I would say at our level, I don't know that consuming any of these chocolate products would have such an extreme level. I mean, if you were a farmer working with these very severe pesticides, you might have an acute severe toxicity. At our level, let's be mindful of what we're putting in our body. In Japan, there's a history of this. They have something called, I think it's, I don't know the pronunciation, but something like Ichi disease or something, which translates to ouch disease, because there's so much bone cadmium in their bone that they have, unique ways of repleting it and pulling it out of the bone. At our level, again, I don't think anyone's by eating these products have that degree of cadmium in them, but nonetheless, things that can help are a high protein diet, making sure you eat all the minerals I just mentioned, which I'll repeat, are calcium, magnesium, iron, and sauna use, sweating is a way to excrete these things. Exercise that would provide, natural sweating is a way to rid them at a sort of daily way of functioning.
So Jen, that's extremely interesting. And also I think kind of shocking and horrifying that it would take so long to detoxify, if you will, cadmium. I think we all understand lead, and while it's not good, we're familiar. Those of us that are old enough are familiar with the lead of the 70s and those reports and things like that. Cadmium is, I guess, more concerning, and the mineral that counteracts high levels of cadmium, is that the calcium or magnesium?
Both do, including iron. So okay. All of these minerals have two little plus signs on them. If you think about, battery charges, positive and negative, they all have 2 plus signs, and so does cadmium. So when they're competing for a receptor, if you have an excess of magnesium, or I should say sufficient amount at least of magnesium or calcium or any of these bivalent ions, that it would sort of compete for the absorption of cadmium.
And can I ask a follow-up then? For those of us that are not super clear on which of those foods are high in calcium and magnesium and iron, what might a few of those be?
So there's something elegant inside dark chocolate because it happens to be high in zinc and magnesium. And so there's something interesting in how nature operates. So that's already protective of the cadmium in it, paradoxically and interestingly. But foods high in iron, spinach, if you want a vegetarian source, is exceedingly high in iron. Vegetarian seafood sources, mussels are exceedingly high in iron. Any other animal product, particularly red meat, is very high in iron. Iron is well absorbed with vitamin C, so any of your citruses. Magnesium is found in great amounts in things like almonds and nuts and many things like that. It's found in trace amounts in so many of the foods we consume. Green leafy vegetables are great for calcium as well.
Thank you.
You bet.
That's fantastic. Okay, so I'm curious, Jen, I know that, I think from your exuberance and from what we've just talked about, you're still a fan of dark chocolate. We should be eating it properly. So how do we incorporate dark chocolate into our diets in the best way, in the most healthful way?
Yeah. I love some of the ways you began with, saying you put chocolate on almost anything, but I will sometimes melt dark chocolate and dip fruit in it and serve it for loved ones, family, friends. I will use cocoa, like really 100% dark, lovely cocoa powder, and make my own hot chocolate at home. I will use that as sort of various sauces and enhance any other dishes I'm making. And my favorite way, frankly, is just to break a piece off a bar and enjoy.
Yes, me too, for sure. I'm seeing a couple of more questions coming in. Please don't hesitate. I think you may have addressed this one, Jen, but I just want to be sure. The specific health risks of cadmium, you talked about kidney and bones, it presenting in that form and that being obviously a serious issue. Anything you'd like to add around specifically cadmium?
So cadmium is most notable because of the kidney. It's long half-life in the kidney tissues in particular. It just can cause renal damage. And what does that mean? Our kidneys are directed to how we filter toxins outside of our body. So it would have a sort of a sluggish effect on helping us detoxify what we need. So that's part one. The other part is our kidneys are related to our fluid regulation. So sometimes that can lead to high blood pressure. Again, this is not relevant for the chocolate bars, but just we can study in extremes and know about the micro effects, but those have exposed to cadmium who've inhaled cadmium toxicity, they would have lung damage because it builds up in the lungs and difficulty breathing. It can be absorbed in the bones. So it would lead to bone weakness and osteoporosis and things like that, particularly in the youth, because bones are being formed at that age.
So Jen, those that know me know that I literally have drawers of chocolate, some in the refrigerator, some maybe in a pantry, but I consume, as we've discussed, that much that I'm very regularly buying chocolate. A number of brands, I guess not surprising, all of them were tested. At least the brands were tested, maybe not necessarily the particular chocolate bar at a particular cocoa level, but all of the brands that I eat were tested in this study. And a number of them did not perform well. And so, I've come to like looking at all the ingredients of chocolate, and they vary quite a bit, in terms of what these companies are putting in their chocolate, whether it's refined sugar or unrefined sugar, or how much, I guess, of the cocoa mass or the cocoa butter is in chocolates. Some of my favorites, because I think they are healthier, are those that are very high. 100% chocolate bar to me isn't necessarily like a snack, right? I feel like, oh, I'm doing my body good, and it's quite bitter, right? But I do eat it. And in that case, you're only seeing as ingredients organic cocoa and organic cocoa butter, as an example, in one of these brands. do we have to eat like these bittersweet 100% chocolates, or what do you recommend in terms of, you know, brands and I guess bars specifically, right? Because I think we've discussed it's really the bar by bar that is important. So what are the bars,
Sure.
you know, or treats that you would recommend?
Prior to the study, I would have said the higher the percent cocoa, the better across the board. Since the study, they have pointed out that the bitter taste and that astringent, lovely, bitter, complex flavor is inherent in the polyphenol. That's what you are tasting. And the higher the content of that, all the health benefits that we talked about earlier are more apt. That said, that also means it absorbs more of this cadmium in areas where the bars are harvested with, or where the beans are harvested with that degree of cocoa. So in this case, it seems the content seems to have a higher propensity to have this cadmium. Now, there was one bar that was off the charts for 100% cocoa, highest flavonoid content, lowest cadmium, lowest lead content. And that happened to be the Montezuma's dark chocolate, 100% absolute black. So when I see that, that is now my go-to bar of choice. I used to eat Ghirardelli 100% on occasion. I used to eat absolute black. I used to eat a bunch of these varieties. I no longer will do that since the publication of this study. So if you want a pure, unsweetened dark, I would go with the Montezuma's. If you want a sweetened chocolate, we can talk about that. If you want to,
Maybe we should talk. I mean, so I'm glad that you noted that. For those out there, as soon as this report came out and all of my friends started texting me like, what are you doing? Have you tested your levels? All that kind of stuff. I should stop there, by the way, and pause. I am going to test my level, and I am going to publicize my cadmium and lead levels, just because I think it's really important.
I agree. I'll join you in it. Yeah.
Awesome. So, you know, I reached out to Jen straight away and I said, Jen, what do we do about this Consumer Reports article? And she, you know, suggested that I turn to Montezuma. So my drawer and my pantries are now full of Montezuma 100%, and they come in variety of flavors. I think there's a mint and there's additional flavors that are also at 100% because it's just a natural additive of mint, fresh organic mint. But as we just noted, maybe we like a little bit of sweet in their chocolate. In that case, what are the bars that you would recommend?
The Consumer Labs and Consumer Reports both came out very strong with this Ghirardelli 72% intense dark as the highest flavonoid content, the lowest lead and cadmium. So according to that, I would follow that. Other bars with a hint of sweet that were recommended are the Chocolate Love brand. I think they call it Strong Dark Chocolate of 70%. The Endangered Species Chocolate Strong and Velvety Dark at 88% was also highly recommended. So those are brands I'm now looking towards and self-selecting. I myself am a consumer of sometimes dark chocolate with sweetness in it that's non-nutritive. Not everyone tolerates non-nutritive sweeteners. By this, I mean erythritol and sometimes monk fruit and others. So I happen to have this on hand. I will show it to the camera. This came highly recommended. It is, I'll maybe hold it here longer. It is Lily's 70% with sea salt inside, and that came out as one of the best artificially sweetened chocolates on the market in terms of its flavanol content and low cadmium and lead.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of other questions, Jen. Have the companies responded to this study?
There was a general response saying they're going to work on minimizing the heavy metals contained in these chocolates. The upside is lead is a lot easier to help eliminate from these chocolates because it tends to be, there's a whole process of how the beans are dehydrated and extracted and fermented, and it's the local dust particles and exhaust from various gasoline components that are in the environment that land on the beans. So simply moving the bean dehydration and fermentation process to a very protected area will eliminate the lead straight away. That's much easier. As we mentioned earlier, it's the sulfophosphorates in the sewage that is contaminated with cadmium that is embedded in the soil, which means a whole replanting of all these cocoa beans, which will take several years to kind of catch up to. So they're on it. It's simply not going to happen overnight in the cadmium sense.
Yeah, I think if you Google this topic at all, you will see, there is a flurry of discussion, rightly so. I'm glad there is, about, the petitions that have been filed, about reactions. Jen, what you just noted in terms of the likely greater ease of getting lead out of the cocoa bean. And I know that some companies have also talked about remedies or yes, I should say remedies to this issue of cadmium by mixing cocoa beans from various plantations, if you will, various regions, so that the cadmium levels would be lower. I'm just looking to see any other questions, Jen. Anything else, Jen, that we should know about?
I know we're both mothers, so mother to mother, for anyone listening to this who may have children, it's very common, particularly this time of year, to come home and make your kids hot cocoa that comes pre-packaged from name your variety. I think Consumer Labs pointed out Nestle as a brand, and it turns out the pre-mixed cocos happen to have higher amounts of cadmium and lead than just pure cocoa. So anyone out there making hot cocoa for your kids or for yourself for that matter, I actually recommend getting one of the recommended cocoa powders. The one that topped the list in Consumer Labs happened to be the sort of, I don't know the way to describe it, but when a major corporation has their own brand, like Target has a brand called Good and Gather. That happened to be the highest in flavonoids, the lowest in cadmium. So I would find a brand like that. Others that were high on the list were Whole Foods 365 organic cocoa brand, turned out to be great. But the hot cocoa mixes happen to have more contaminants than the sort of plain cocoa. So if your kids like sweeteners, that's perfectly fine. Find your favorite milk, water, heat it up and add whatever sweetener you like rather than buying the pre-mixed cocoa packets, I think would be helpful.
Fantastic. That's a great point. Another question, Jen, is there anything we can do as consumers to test the products that we already have, right? Like the cadmium lead, is anything we can do?
If only, I wish. Yeah, these are tested in a particular lab using very sophisticated testing processes like high HLPC, which is like a very sophisticated, you need a certain kind of, you need highly sophisticated lab equipment. I won't go into the details, but that's not a sort of do it yourself at home test. But I would say vote with your feet. Alaina and I will link to what chocolate brands were recommended, not recommended. And if some of these more artisanal brands lose market share, I think they're going to quickly have to pivot. I was surprised to see that, some of the chocolate brands my own mother used growing up, like Baker's, unsweetened varieties, happen to actually, Ghirardelli, like these old brands, happen to have the lowest levels and turned out to be safe. And these more artisanal brands that I was seduced by as a marketer from a consumer perspective were actually the ones that were not as healthy. So just know what you're buying and where it comes from and vote with your feet. Absolutely. Well said. For your dollars. That's right. Vote with our dollars for sure. Thank you, Jen. We'll keep the kind of the Q&A open for the next few minutes, but I do want to be conscious of everyone's time and look to kind of close here. So thank you again, everyone, for joining. And thank you, Jen, for taking the time. I'm really just so fortunate to have met Jen about a year and a half ago or so, and she's been such a supporter of Furthermore and of me, and as you can see, such a wealth of information and a leader in this space. So love what you're doing, Jen. Thank you. Obviously, we would love to have your feedback. Jen, I don't know if there's an email address that you're happy to take additional follow-up questions. If there is, we can talk about that now if you'd like to state that. Sure. I'll state the obvious that I'm here providing information that's purely meant to be informational and educational. Just because I'm a physician does not mean I'm your physician. And that this discussion was prompted by both Alaina and I being avid chocoholics, if I may say, and consumers of dark chocolate. So we were both interested, and I was interested in, I recommend dark chocolate regularly to my patients who are looking to find an alternative to, laden sugar, white flour products. So I was getting a lot of questions from them. Alaina was getting her own questions. So we partnered in Align to answer. We did not independently conduct any of these studies on our own, but we are reporting what we found in the research from consumer labs and consumer reports.
Absolutely. If you have any follow-up questions or feedback, feel free to send it to hello@furthermoreventures.com, and we can take your answers, or we can provide answers, sorry, there. And as Jen noted, she has written an article about dark chocolate, and we'll be posting that on Medium and on LinkedIn here shortly. So do yourself a favor, regardless of the article, do yourself a favor of following Dr. Kraker. You will definitely see that article there, and you can share. One quick question, Jen. If you're experiencing various symptoms and are a chocolate consumer, would you recommend a hair test as a first look at your own level of cadmium, or go forth to a medical team, to see your doctor?
I imagine no one watching this, I would be shocked if anyone watching this would have acute symptoms from a massive, the acute symptoms come from a really high dose, massive exposure that's if you were a farmer working with pesticides, particularly that were high in some of the things we mentioned, then and only then might you experience this bone pain or have sudden onset high blood pressure. The acute symptoms of high lead exposure are sort of like muscle aches, weakness, myalgia, sometimes nausea, diarrhea, just sort of mental confusion and disorientation. And consuming these products on occasion or even with regularity is unlikely to produce that degree of a symptom. So this might be sort of insidious, where you wouldn't realize that you have a buildup in these. If you happen to be a high consumer and know that you are, as Alaina and I will both do, I would advise you see your own local medical practitioner, test for these levels, see if they're elevated, and then take the subsequent steps from there. But I would suspect no one will actually be symptomatic as a result of this.
Encouraging, and thank you. I think it will be very informative to see what our levels are, and again, we will be sharing them. A couple other quick, kind of closing comments. Love if you would subscribe. Jen has a newsletter. Furthermore has a newsletter. You will receive direct invitations to events like this going forward. And we'd also love your recommendations. So if you find a chocolate bar and you are curious about levels, or you're curious what Dr. Jen might have to say about that chocolate bar or chocolate treat, do let us know. And in true, I guess, keeping to the Furthermore mission, we are always looking specifically for women-owned brands, or women-founded brands, if you will, that are doing the right thing, right, for our bodies, for society, for the environment. So we will also be updating if we find brands that we're really supportive of. Interestingly enough, the Montezuma brand that Dr. Kraker had recommended is a couple-founded, men and women co-founded brand of chocolate from the UK. So we're pleased to support them. But if you know of any other brands, given your own research, we'd love to hear. Jen, anything else in closing? I'm just looking one more time at the chat and Q&A.
Nothing other than thank you for all that you do and what you're doing with Furthermore and inspiring local brands and women-inspired wonderful food to human and health products. I just love what you're doing. I'm really proud of you. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all again for being here. And thank you, Jen. We hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. Bye.